Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox. Welcome to the show. Today I have something really special for you. I'm joined in the studio by my right-wing contributor. Introduce yourself to the audience. Hello Internet, I'm Foxy Jack, and man, we really need to talk about this vaccine. You know what, Foxy, I really agree with you. I think that the way that the vaccine has been covered in the media and the way that people talk about it even today is a little bit problematic. And it all kind of comes back from that monkey brain thing I was talking about in a previous video, where we'd like to take a lot of logical shortcuts to think that we understand something, and these logical shortcuts can lead us to error. But I'm glad to have you on, and I wanted to give you this opportunity to share with us your feelings about the virus and the vaccine. Well, here's how I feel, Jackie. If you really listen to the experts and do your own research, you'll find that you've been lied to about the effectiveness of this vaccine. It just doesn't work. Now, why would a government push a vaccine that just doesn't work on the entirety of a public? I mean, they told us that if we just stayed at home and quit our jobs for 2-3 weeks, and all got the jab and shoved 2 doses, even 3 doses of whatever we could get into our arms, that all of this would be over. And so clearly that hasn't happened. So what was the purpose in making us take a useless vaccine to begin with? Obviously, this is all for the benefit of Big Pharma and their big bottom line. Well, while I definitely don't disagree that there were some problems with the way, especially on your side of the media, unfortunately, that we reacted to this and we reported on this story, I just find it hard to see where you're coming from with the position of the vaccine didn't work. We have mountains of evidence, more and more every day, that show us just how this vaccine does work and just how effective it happens to be, and still happens to be after multiple mutations that have increased the contagiousness of this virus, maybe even at this point by an order of magnitude or more. And, you know, Big Pharma has made a lot of money off of this, and I myself am critical of that because it feels like their profiteering kept us from actually stopping the pandemic, because they didn't want to release their copyrights on this virus, even though we are dealing with a global pandemic. So if we don't solve this problem in the entirety of the world at once, it's just going to keep spreading in some area out of control. That's going to lead to a new strain developing, a new mutation that makes it more contagious, which is eventually going to work its way back to us, and then we're all starting from square one again. And honestly, this happened so many times during the pandemic that it would drive a person to nihilism. Well, that's what I mean. The vaccine just doesn't work. It never worked. I mean, they told us if we just get the jab, we'll be completely safe. There's no chance that we'll die. It's the most amazing vaccine ever. It came out of nowhere in no time, but it was definitely thoroughly safety regulated. And it has, and and all of the liberal news outlets are telling us that it's like 100% effective, and yet people still die. How is that? How is that the case? How can the vaccine be successful if I can take it, get the jab, still catch COVID, and die? Well, while this particular vaccine happened to be way more effective than previous iterations of vaccination technology, which average a success rate of maybe 70 to 80%. I mean, the flu vaccine is like this, and even less each year, because in many times with flu mutations, it can very heavily impact the effectiveness of the vaccines that we have on hand for it. Sometimes we have to prepare multiple types of vaccination for different strains just to be sure that we are prepared for the one that eventually ends up spreading during flu season. We never claimed that it had 100% effectiveness, though. I mean, we did talk about, say, like the mid-90s, maybe 92 to 97% at the very beginning. And this is an incredible and unprecedented vaccine. Furthermore, while I don't have time to get into the safety of the vaccine, I definitely have made videos on this in the past, which you can check out. And I'm sure, Foxy, you've already seen them, being a big fan of the channel, right? But the vaccines are definitely effective. It's not that you won't catch COVID. It's that you are much less likely to have a severe case of COVID if you do. And you are much more likely to not even notice that you get it when you get it, because your immune response was just that strong and well crafted to fight it off. And it's not just about you being tremendously less likely to die. You're also significantly less likely to be hospitalized, even beyond that. And that was a major concern for us, especially early on in the pandemic, because we were really concerned that our very limited hospital infrastructure would be overwhelmed by the number of cases that we could get during a significant spike of the virus. And it seems that even though we were really pushing at some stress lines within the industry, I mean, you had people walking around in trash bags performing surgery, and somehow the vaccine kept us, even as these things have gotten more contagious, even as the case has gotten more serious, from having that overflow in the hospitals, which is crucially important from a public health perspective, and crucially important if you have to go to the hospital for a reason that isn't COVID. You would like for them to be able to get to you, wouldn't you? That doesn't change the fact that the liberal news media lied to us about this whole thing. I mean, they told us that we wouldn't be able to spread this thing if we only got this vaccine. Keep everybody around you safe, they said. Worry about your grandma, they said. But as it turns out, people who get the vaccine can still infect other people. Wouldn't you know it? Well, yeah, but you're significantly less likely to. I mean, it seems like you're dealing with this whole situation in these comical absolutes that wouldn't apply to any other vaccine we've ever had and still don't apply to this one. If you have a significantly less serious case, you have less of a viral load. That means you have less virus in you to expel from your body, making you contagious to other people. This makes you significantly less contagious, in addition to all of the benefits that I've already mentioned about risks to your personal health. Not only does it make you safer, it makes people around you significantly safer. But there is a non-zero chance that even with a very small viral load, you can spread it to another person. Although there is something really important about this virus and many viruses that you should understand. If you have less of a viral load, then you spread less of the virus even when you do spread it. So in those cases where a vaccinated person spreads the virus to another person, even if that person is unvaccinated, they are less likely to have a serious case than if they had gotten that same virus from someone who was unvaccinated, who had the virus running wild through their body and had massive amounts coming out when they did spread it and while they were contagious. Because basically, the vaccine would have to fight an uphill battle with low numbers to really take hold of your immune system. Whereas if you got it from someone who was unvaccinated, you were much more likely to catch a higher initial viral load, which means that the virus had to do a bit less replication and take a bit less time to ramp up your symptoms and overwhelm your immune system. That doesn't change the fact that the liberal news media has been lying to us this whole time. I mean, look at them supporting the big cloth industry. They sold us on cloth masks, even though they don't stop the spread of COVID. Even an N95 mask, if you put it on wrong, does not stop the spread of COVID. And only recently has the liberal news media even been willing to admit the fact that cloth masks don't stop the spread. What's up with that? I mean, maybe everything that you're saying is true, but why did the media have to lie to us about this every step of the way? What's up? Oh, I'm sorry. My producer is saying that we're running out of time. We're gonna have to cut to an ad break. So, you know, yeah, let's just cut this one here. Is that all right with everybody? Everybody back there? Okay, cool. See, you lying liberals, you just want to cut me off. Hey, thank you for watching the Jackie Fox News Network. If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can paste those links on the screen into your search bar and send me some money. I'd really appreciate it. And now, back to the news. It's easy to see the ways that we went wrong in how we handled the COVID-19 virus. And it's easy to see how the shorthands that the media took in addressing this made it easier for us to understand, but also gave us a really skewed view of reality and a skewed set of expectations for what a vaccine should do, what the purpose of wearing a mask was, even if it wasn't the best mask that would be most appropriate for the situation. And I made a video about this previously. I explained it pretty well there, but I'm going to go into it again with a bit more hindsight. I made that pretty early on. It's easy to see how the media didn't do a great job of explaining this to the public. But there's a lot of people who have cynically played this up as an opportunity to basically lie to you about various things. And all of these things have in turn undermined public health's ability to control the spread, and all of these things led to mutations and worse versions of the virus, all because we didn't understand what the point of public health was to begin with. And to explain it, we're going to have to dive into the weeds for just a bit and get into some of the specifics of how the scientists actually think about these things and a few of the biological principles at play here. The first thing that I want you to understand is the R0 value, or R0 as it's represented. From here on in the video, I'm going to do my best to call this an R value. And essentially what it is, what R stands for, is the rate of spread. The amount of people that the average infected individual will spread the virus to, that is what an R value is. So an R value of 0 would mean that there's absolutely no chance that anyone infected by this virus can spread it to anyone else. And the goal is to get the R value as close to 0 as possible. And maybe even an R value of 0.5 is good because this is a exponential decline. But even an R value of 1 is certainly better than something higher than that, because then at least each person getting infected isn't infecting multiple people, allowing for an exponential increase. It took us a while to determine what the R value of the initial strain of COVID was, because we basically needed a lot of data that we were at the time doing a very poor job of tracking. But ultimately we determined that the initial variant of COVID had an R value of about 2.4 when it first reared its ugly head. Now, one thing that's important to understand about R values is that this is, again, the likelihood that you will spread the virus to someone else. And therefore, it's not something that's like printed on the surface of the virus. It's not like you can look at a virus in isolation and say, well, this has an R value of X. That's just not how this works, because there's a lot of social things, there's a lot of public health things that can actually change that number, and that is largely the purpose of public health within a pandemic and without an outbreak like this. So think about it like this. The initial strain of COVID has a chance of spreading to another person of about 2.4. So let's say that a cloth mask is 95% ineffective in stopping the spread of COVID, but 5% effective. And also it's important to note, that viral load, the size of viral load is important here. So even if you aren't catching all of the virus, even if the cloth mask isn't preventing all of it from entering the environment, it is preventing a bit of it. So even in the chance that it does spread the virus, it spreads a less severe case that will likely itself lead to that person infecting fewer people. But also, just the effect of that 5%, that pushes the number down a little bit. In this case, it would push it down to about 2.28, which isn't amazing, but it is an improvement. We're starting to get there. When you layer onto that concepts like lockdowns, like imagine a completely strict lockdown that lasted for like 3 weeks. Everyone would be stuck in their home. The most people that you could possibly infect, if you had the virus at that point, is everyone else in your home. Let's say you live in a 4-person household, and you are the person who is sick with COVID at the beginning of the lockdown. Your personal R value is basically going to be 3, because you're probably going to affect everyone else in your house. And then, for all of them, since there's no one else to affect in the house, their R value suddenly drops down to 0. Now, we don't think of the R value on the individual level, but that's kind of how that would work. The R value is meant to be applied to large groups in society. And if you kept people in this situation for long enough, then all of the COVID would die out within our homes, assuming it isn't being spread by animal populations or some sort of extraneous factor. That is theoretically a way to get COVID's R value, no matter how contagious it is. Well, with some logical, again, animal spreading or being able to live in the environment or being able to escape the air gaps in your house and float over to your neighbor's house and into theirs. Assuming crazy things like that don't happen, this would be a way to take any virus to an R value of about 0. And then when you combine efforts like that with the idea of a vaccine, which might be, 92, 97% effective, if even 50% of people took a vaccine that was that effective, that alone could reduce the R value to something near 1. And if 75% of people got vaccinated, that might be able to reduce the R value to something near 0.5, at which point we're starting to experience exponential decline. And if more people than that became vaccinated, and also there is, and this is ultimately what they mean by herd immunity, which is really complicated by the idea of mutation. If viruses didn't mutate, herd immunity would be much easier to reach. Also, if herd immunity assumes that we have long-term natural immunity, which doesn't necessarily seem to be the case here with this particular virus, as people can catch it multiple times, vaccinated or not. But the more people who catch it, the more people build immunity to it. It's kind of like the natural version of vaccination. It's much more dangerous for the individual. That's why we prefer vaccination, but it has a similar effect. So viruses will, if they don't mutate, ultimately lower their R value over time as well. When you add all of these things together, when you add to that the practice of social distancing, even if that isn't perfectly effective, then we can layer all of these only somewhat effective things on top of each other, combine them with a vaccine, and with all of our efforts, all of our little efforts combined, we can get to a place where we can go anywhere between an exponential decline in the number of people infected or just a complete loss of infection in general. And that was our goal. But due to the fact that we kind of assumed a lot of maximalist outcomes, some vaccines work better than others in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different variables to a vaccine. How long is the protection? How long does that last? If you catch it, will it do such a good job of eliminating it that you won't be contagious at all? We unfortunately assumed a lot of things, like that you couldn't spread the virus if you were vaccinated. There was a particular case, and in retrospect, I'm sad I didn't work this into my argument at the beginning, where there were universities where all the students were vaccinated, like they had mandatory vaccinations to attend the university for that semester, and they put them all in dorms, and they still ended up having outbreaks. And disingenuously, you could say, see, look, even the vaccinated people are spreading this. Obviously, the vaccine is doing nothing to do anything, kind of completely disregarding all of those other smaller gains, and also disregarding the fact that frankly, in this particular case, the college got cocky. They didn't have them social distance. They crammed them all into dorms, and they didn't have them wear masks on campus. And all of those things together, combined with that low rate of transmission, by the fact that we weren't doing anything else to also limit the transmission, people got infected. It wasn't an immediate super spreader event like we've seen in other places with more unvaccinated populations, but it was significant. It was worth talking about. And it was worth considering that perhaps the vaccine was giving people a little bit too much confidence. That was the point where we started to say, you know what, even if you are vaccinated, you still probably need to keep wearing that mask. And, of course, this was treated by the conservative news networks as a betrayal. You told us if we got the vaccine, we wouldn't have to wear a mask anymore. Like, look, I've worn these type of masks in like 120 degree conditions. The mask gets so logged with your own sweat that it becomes like waterboarding to breathe through. And I did this in a hard ass work environment for like 12 hours a day. Don't fucking tell me you can't wear a mask in an air-conditioned grocery store, you obnoxious piece of shit. I mean, why is this even a problem? Just wear the goddamn mask. It's not that terribly inconvenient. And as I alluded to in the intro, one of the biggest problems and the reason that we keep having mutations, which always tend to pop up in some third world country that can't afford to import vaccines and doesn't have the knowledge or capability, although often a lot more of them have the capability than you would think. If we uncopyrighted the vaccine, there are a lot of places in India and even in Africa that could manufacture this vaccine. They just need to know how. Anyways, it's the fact that we didn't do this that I think is really the biggest reason that we're still dealing with COVID being one of the most prevalent ways you get sick. Like, I don't hear about people getting the flu or the cold anymore because those viruses are being so massively outcompeted by modern versions of COVID. I mean, even in the viral world, evolution happens so fast that it's like a hyper-Darwinist system. It is very much a survival of the fittest. And it honestly should be a bit frightening that we are facing a virus that we have allowed to get so far out of hand that we're facing something that is now more common than the common cold. That we have been kind of living with at a certain level of being endemic within our society. It's a scary place, and so many of the bad faith arguments against the vaccine work almost exclusively because it is so easy to find examples of public health officials fucking this up. And not because they weren't saying what they thought we needed to hear, but the fact that they were changing their story to suit us. It does feel like being lied to. It is something that I have referred to in the past as paternalism, thinking that daddy knows best, so you don't need to know the real facts, we're just going to tell you what we think you need to hear to do the right thing. And, you know, they were trying. This is a complicated topic. I've already been talking about it for over 30 minutes now, and I feel like I still haven't explained a lot of things that are crucial to understanding this. So how the fuck is Dr. Fauci supposed to do this job on CNN in a 3-minute conversation? That doesn't mean I particularly like the way that he did it or the way that anybody did it. And again, I think that it's these missteps that led us to the point where people can kind of cherry pick evidence and seem rational, making completely irrational arguments. This should be something where you just tell the truth and shut them down, but we've been fed these little white lies so often during the response to this pandemic that We just don't know what to believe anymore. And that uncertainty and that doubt that has bred from that is a virus unto itself. And I know I framed this as a conservative versus liberal issue, but there are even people on the left that are skeptical for a lot of these reasons, especially taking that, well, they're only doing this for big pharma's profits. This is just more corporatism. And again, I have some issues with the profit motives of saving lives. Like, I think I'm a more moral person than the people who are making the decisions for these big pharma companies. I mean, they pushed opiates on everyone knowing that it would lead to addiction and death simply because it was profitable for them. There's plenty of reason to distrust many of the institutions that are involved in this. But that doesn't mean that they're lying. And again, I think the profit motive does actually work out to be, when you understand how all of this works, one of the biggest factors in why we have had such a long, protracted case of COVID throughout the world, and why this is becoming endemic and taking over the spots in the viral food chain that things like cold and flu season typically held. And there's a certain part of this to where a lot of the claims that were made at the time that were baseless, that were wild, that were almost crazy, have eventually come around to be true. And some of these jackasses are acting as though they're vindicated. I mean, in the context of when they were speaking, they were wrong to say that COVID was anything like the flu. But at this point, after its evolution, it might become our new flu, and it might be very similar to that, although all signs show that it will be much more contagious. This might be a thing that kills at-risk groups every year, and that we vaccinate to present with an annual vaccine, the same way that we deal with the flu now. But that sure as hell wasn't true when I made my original videos, and there's a certain danger of knowing everything at all time, having every take cataloged on the internet, because some of them age poorly and some of them, for all the wrong reasons, actually end up aging well. That's why it's important to view these things in the context that they were intended, as they were presented at that time, as opposed to, well, you know, he was an asshole for saying it then, but at least it's true now. And it still isn't necessarily true that even the version of COVID we have now is equal to the flu. It's just, it seems like it's kind of taking over its niche in our ecosystem, which is, again, kind of scary, and a thing that we actually could have prevented with global vaccination programs, and a thing that our corporate greed very much prevented us from doing. I promise I am trying to keep this under 40 minutes, but there is another important angle here, and that is just some realities that stem from the polarization, and particularly the political polarization of America's mainstream media. In the, while I described a number of times where the liberal media told little white lies, which the conservative media then turned into opportunities to tell their own big ol' whoppers, there were also a lot of times where just acknowledging that the reality of the situation was changing was seen as like, well, they've been lying to you all along because now they're changing their story, when this is an evolving situation, for one, hugely unprecedented in the modern era. We don't really know how to react to it initially, but we have general guidelines for this kind of stuff. We have best practices. We try to put those in place. Some of them don't work, so we try new things. And that isn't that someone was lying to you. We've become really paranoid that the news is lying to us kind of across the board. And, there is some basis in reality for that, as I've said, but it also caused us to just build a whole lot of mountains out of things that weren't even fucking molehills. Like, not even anthills. They were practically caves. There was so little to some of these bullshit stories. And at the same time, when you do make a mistake that was genuinely a mistake, you know, there is so much media dedicated to MSNBC and CNN waiting for a really stupid Fox News take to just take to task and make cheap, easy clickbait attack media off of it. And then there's plenty of times when Fox News does the exact same to MSNBC and CNN and the points that they're making. And in this news environment, the idea of admitting that you got something wrong is tantamount to like political suicide. Like, woo, they admitted that they're lying now. You know, you're just writing the fucking story for them. So there were a lot of times which, especially the liberal media, just instead of acknowledging that they had made a mistake, they just kind of acted like, well, A, we never said that, and B, this is what you should do. They, you know, kind of corrected the record in that kind of 1984 way where you kind of memory hole the last thing that we told you, because we weren't wrong. We've been saying this all along, for sure. Check, just go check. Yeah, it's... And, you know, again, this is just another place where, like, the culture war has just fucking ruined everything for us, and this kind of call-out culture that has been bred into the algorithms where, you know, the thing that works on every algorithm in every platform is outrage. And it's easy to get outraged at the other side, especially if they are saying some particularly obnoxious shit. But it also creates a space in which it becomes that kind of political suicide to actually admit that you made a mistake. We have to be able to do that, or our news media just can't function properly. So I don't really know how to tie that into the next thing. I'll be honest with you. Another point that I have to make before ending this video, since I brought it up in the kind of confrontational intro, was that the reason, and this got really lost in the 24-hour news cycle and reduced to just wear a mask, okay? The original reason that we were wearing cloth masks, we acknowledged that N95 masks would be better, but N95 masks were an incredibly niche product before the pandemic. It wasn't the kind of thing that there were huge stockpiles of waiting for everybody to put one on in America every day. Like, there wasn't supply. And in addition to that, our supply chains were going to fucking shit. So there was no way to really spin up supply or to increase imports from someplace like China, which they were up to their neck in COVID themselves, you know? That's where we get a lot of our cheap mass-produced shit, and they were up to neck in COVID themselves, so they were keeping all of that stuff for themselves. We had to wait until we could really establish good domestic production of N95 masks at significant enough rates that the whole population could adopt this strategy. I mean, ultimately, we were trying to save the limited N95 masks we initially had for those who were most severely at risk. It was kind of a sacrifice that we were doing the best that we could and saving the really important stuff for the people who needed it most, like the immunocompromised or people that we imagined wouldn't be able to get a vaccine. Because again, we were thinking it might be years before we could get a vaccine at the point where we really first started talking about masks. And it does feel really weird how suddenly cloth masks became unacceptable once the media acknowledged that we had reached the point with N95 that that's really what you needed to be wearing and changed the public health guidance on masks. And again, all of this nuance makes that make sense, but at the same time, that got reduced really quickly to just wear mask in the 24-hour news cycle in a way that it kind of turns everything into a simulacra of itself and just reduces everything to the most basic message of just wear mask. And this led to a bunch of really disingenuous takes, as all of these things have. And, you know, again, the media didn't necessarily handle it well because it felt like they were doing a weird 180 or just escalating when, and this is also the weird thing, they got mad about the fact that they changed the guidance to N95 masks, but pretty much up until that point, one of the biggest logical reasons why the right was pushing, and the only one that really made sense why they were kind of pushing, like, why are we wearing cloth masks, is because they were insufficient and we should be wearing N95 masks. And then suddenly, when the public health guidance turns to everyone should wear N95 masks, all of a sudden everybody loses their fucking minds all over again. It's just, we were all going through a lot during COVID, and we had some weird fucking copes, let me tell you, brothers and sisters, and everything in between and outside of the gender binary. It was a weird fucking time for America, and I'm sure it was a weird fucking time for the world. There's one more thing that I want to get into in relation to this, and also in relation to my last video where I talked about the idea of big city brain. And I think that there's a big city brain angle on this as well, because there were a lot of people in newsrooms where they were living under completely different conditions for the very base fact that cities tend to have densely concentrated populations. And the one thing that helps a virus spread, probably more than anything else, is density and concentration of people. When you walk past 300 or more people on your way to work every day, and all of them are at a much greater risk of contracting COVID than somebody who lives out in the country, drives 15 minutes to work alone in their car, and only has like 6 or 7 other coworkers and very few customers they have to directly interact with. There are very different realities for viruses based on where you live in the country, whether you are rural or where you are urban. And it's not the case, because all of this is obviously very nuanced. I don't want to make the shortcut of saying that somehow rural communities are immune to this, because they aren't. Although we did see that the virus first came into the big cities, because the big cities are most likely to have, through airport or port access, people coming in from all over the world that could bring this with them, but also because the density of their populations makes the spread easy. But eventually people from those cities are going to go into rural areas, and eventually it's going to catch just the right thing. I mean, we saw the cities doing terribly at the beginning for a very long time, and it seemed like the virus was just skipping over America's rural areas, until eventually, due to, in part, lax public health efforts, each one of those communities, eventually, the virus, as it became more contagious, was able to catch on there, overcome the natural barriers of country life in spreading a virus, and spread like wildfire through those largely unvaccinated and not having natural immunity even this many months into the pandemic, because it had never been an issue here before, populations. But then after those major outbreaks that made those said rural areas take it seriously for a while, months at most after that, most of these same places had basically no rules on the books for how to deal with COVID. They dropped all of the public health about as quickly as they could get COVID out of their population for the first time. While at the same time, the risk never really died down in the same way in the big cities, because in the rural areas, you either got vaccinated or you probably caught it at some point. So in some way, you all have immunity, and you have a very low contagion rate compared to a big city, which, even if a big city does everything right, just that concentration of people will make the contagion rate exponentially higher, or more likely. And because of that, a lot of big cities, where a lot of these news organizations happen to exist, had a lot more onerous pandemic restrictions than the rest of the country, which created this really odd divide where a lot of especially conservative pundits were perhaps talking honestly about the pandemic restrictions that existed around them. I mean, they weren't making these things up, but they were projecting them as though they were a threat to the entire country and to their largely rural viewers, and they really weren't. We don't live in the city. We're not going to have the same big city public health reaction because it's not as necessary. Should we still be cautious? Again, I don't want anyone to take this and oversimplify it and interpret it such that rural communities are immune from this, but we are at less risk. Therefore, we need to do less to lower our local R naught values to a safe place, whereas the comparative R naught value in a big city is always going to be higher purely because it is a big city. So this ends up with this interesting case of all of these conservative Fox News supporters that have been watching too much Tucker Carlson complaining about how Fox News wants him to get a vaccine while not explicitly saying that he's gotten a vaccine or that Fox News is the one who's making him get a vaccine, but Fox News made him get a vaccine while he was being very anti-vax on air, which is hilarious. But this led to a phenomenon of his mostly rural viewers protesting mandates that didn't exist where they were and haven't existed where they were for the majority of the pandemic. Because the only places in this country that have had consistent restrictions are the same big cities that a lot of these news organizations happen to headquarter in. And at a certain level, I think that one of the benefits of big city brain is that you have to be a bit more communitarian to live in a big city. You can't be quite as individualistic as you can be in the country. And the reason for that is that you are just so densely up in other people's shit that other people's shit actually becomes really important to you in a more fundamental way than when you can be a lot more isolated. So I dare to believe that even a pundit like Tucker Carlson fully understands why Fox News wanted him to vaccinate, which is probably why he didn't bring that specific part of the story up, and why it was important for people in cities to do this. But he also knew that he had a bunch of rural people who maybe had only known one period of time where there was a huge risk that everyone was going to get COVID, and then for most of the rest of it, it's just a couple of people getting sick, maybe a friend of a friend that you know, and it's not relatable to them that the government would have such a harsh reaction, even when they aren't taking into account that the government is only having that harsh reaction in a place that has a very different that has very different realities of life and population density than the place that they are currently residing in. So there we are. This seems like to me to be a pretty comprehensive deconstruction of all of the weird cognitive biases and rationalizations and copes that we have developed over the pandemic to try to tell us that there's some conspiracy that the virus doesn't matter, that the vaccine doesn't work, and that everyone is lying to you about everything. Because there are lies. There are ways in which the vaccine doesn't work as well as we might hope it would. And there are definitely public health failures on both sides of the aisle in the way that this has been handled. There are numerous opportunities for Biden to have removed at least the copyrights from the American versions of the vaccines to save the world. And even though I called out to him on this channel to do it, he left us in the lurch just like Donald Trump did. There are a lot of things to legitimately criticize, but I think that a lot of these problems have been caused by poor communication. So, we need to learn how to communicate how this shit actually works more effectively to people across the board. And I know this video is a bit long and that might limit the number of people that would be interested in watching it, but I don't know what else to say other than I'm trying to do the work. So if you appreciate that, remember that commercial in the beginning, you can go to these links right here and send me some money to help make my life a little less drenched in poverty. But I think I'll be fine even if you don't. So if you are also drenched in poverty, well, solidarity to you, bro. You ain't got to give me money, but you know that I would appreciate it. You know that that would help in the same way that it would help you. So, stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video, which won't have Foxy Jack in it. Guy's an asshole. Weird hat, too. Somehow, in fact, it all just reminds me of Tim Pool. Oh well.